The old woman's hands were bleeding by the time the sun began to set, but the mountain man still hadn't spoken a word of kindness. Lin Mei had crossed 3 territories and nearly died twice to reach this cabin, the last place on earth that might take her in. Now she stood in the yard of a man whose reputation arrived before his name, Gideon Rourke, the trapper who once left a man to freeze for stealing his pelts. If she couldn't prove her worth before nightfall, she'd be turned back into the wilderness. And the wilderness didn't forgive the old or the weak. If you're watching this, please hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The mountains held no mercy for the frail. Lin Mei had learned this truth over 6 brutal days of walking, each step a negotiation between her will and her body's desperate plea to stop. Her feet, wrapped in cloth that had once been part of her apron, left faint smudges of blood on the rocks. The tin box she carried, no bigger than a book, had bruised her ribs purple from where it pressed against her side, suspended by a leather cord across her shoulder. But she wouldn't leave it behind. It was all she had left of the kitchen in San Francisco's Chinatown, the small restaurant she'd run with her husband Wei for 32 years. The kitchen where the scent of star anise and Sichuan peppercorn had mixed with his laughter, where her hands had moved with the confidence of a woman who knew her craft down to the bone. Wei was 3 months buried now, and the new owners of the building had given her a week to disappear. So she'd taken the spice box, $17 in coins, and started walking. Away from the city that no longer wanted her. Away from the neighborhood where younger faces now filled the streets. Away from everything except the vague memory of a letter Wei had once received from a distant cousin who'd mentioned work in a mining camp somewhere east, high in the mountains. She never found the camp. What she found instead was emptiness, miles of it, rock and dust and wind that scraped the moisture from her lips and left her tongue thick as leather. On the 6th day, she'd begun to understand she was going to die out here. Then the wind shifted, and she smelled smoke. Not wildfire, wood smoke. The kind that came from a chimney, from a stove, from people. Lin Mei lifted her head, squinting through the haze of exhaustion. There, maybe half a mile up the slope, a thin gray line rose against the darker gray of the mountainside. She walked toward it. Her vision swam. Twice she stumbled, catching herself on rocks that tore new cuts into her palms. The tin box swung and banged against her side. Her breath came in short gasps that didn't seem to bring enough air, but she kept walking. The cabin appeared gradually, like something emerging from a dream. It wasn't large, just a single structure built directly into the rock face, with a stone chimney and a roof of weathered wood. A lean-to stable stood to one side, and she could see the dark shapes of animal pelts stretched on frames in the yard. A man stood near the woodpile, axe in hand. He'd already seen her. She could tell by the absolute stillness of his posture, the way he watched her approach without moving, without calling out, without offering any gesture of welcome or warning. Lin Mei stopped at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet from where he stood. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair that hung past his collar and a beard that obscured most of his face. His clothes were rough, leather and homespun wool, stained with work and weather. His eyes, she noticed, were the color of creek water, pale and cold. They studied her with the detached interest of a man examining a wounded animal he hasn't decided whether to help or shoot. "Water," Lin Mei said. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, cracked and dry. "Please." The man said nothing. She tried again, forcing the words past her swollen tongue. "I can work. For food. For shelter. Just tonight." For a long moment he didn't respond. Then he turned deliberately away from her and sank the axe into the chopping block with a solid thunk. "You got money?" he asked. His voice was deep, rough from disuse. "No." "Family coming for you? Husband? Sons?" "No." He picked up an armful of split logs, still not looking at her directly. "Then you'll work for it. There's a pump behind the cabin. Drink what you need. After that, you haul wood until I tell you to stop. Stack it against the north wall, tight and neat. You do that, you can sleep in the stable tonight and I'll give you something to eat. You don't, you move on." Lin Mei's legs were shaking. She wasn't sure she could lift a single log, let alone haul enough to satisfy this man's definition of sufficient work. But she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't acknowledge it. just walked past her toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. She found the pump where he'd said, a rusty iron thing that groaned when she worked the handle. The water that came out ran cold and clear, tasting of minerals and stone. She drank until her stomach cramped, then splashed her face and the back of her neck. The relief was so profound she nearly wept. But there was no time for that. The sun was already low, painting the peaks orange and gold. She had maybe 2 hours of good light left. Lin Mei walked to the woodpile on unsteady legs. The split logs were heavy, each piece a solid weight of pine or cedar, rough enough to tear skin. She wrapped her arms around one, lifted it with a grunt of effort, and began the slow walk to the north wall. 20 feet. It might as well have been 20 miles. She made it, set the log down carefully in line with the others already stacked there, and went back for another. Then another, and another. From inside the cabin, she could feel the man watching through the window. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the weight of his gaze, just kept walking, kept lifting, kept stacking. Her back began to scream somewhere around the 20th log. By the 30th, her hands were cramping so badly she could barely maintain her grip. When she bent to lift the 40th piece, something in her lower back seized with a pain so sharp it stole her breath. She stood there, hands on her knees, gasping. Through the window, she saw the curtain move. He's watching to see if I quit, she thought, waiting for me to prove I'm too old, too weak, too useless. Lin Mei straightened slowly, forcing her spine to uncurl despite the fire that ran down her legs. She reached for the next log. The sun touched the western peaks and began its slide toward darkness. She worked through the pain, through the trembling in her arms, through the moment when her vision went gray at the edges and she thought she might faint. She worked until the last of the daylight faded and the first stars appeared in the deep blue overhead. When she finally stacked the last log she could physically manage, there were 63 pieces lined against the north wall. Lin Mei stood in the growing darkness, swaying slightly, her breath coming in ragged pulls. Blood had seeped through the cloth wrapped around her feet. Her hands were ribboned with splinters and fresh cuts. The cabin door opened. The man stood silhouetted against the lamplight from within, still holding that same unreadable expression. "Stable's open," he said. "There's straw in the corner. I'll bring you something to eat." Then he closed the door. Lin Mei made her way to the stable on legs that barely held her weight. Inside she found what he'd promised, a corner filled with reasonably clean straw, away from the 2 horses that watched her with dark, disinterested eyes. She collapsed into it, too exhausted even to remove her torn shoes. 15 minutes later, the door creaked open again. The man entered carrying a tin plate and a cup. He set them on the ground near her without a word, a piece of hardtack, some dried meat, and water. "Thank you," Lin Mei managed. He paused, looking at her for the first time with something that might have been curiosity rather than judgment. "You always work that hard for strangers?" he asked. "I work that hard to survive," she said quietly. Something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or memory. Then it was gone, replaced by that same stony reserve. "Name's Gideon," he said. "Gideon Rourke. You need something during the night, you stay in here. Don't come to the cabin." "My name is Lin Mei." He nodded once, then left, pulling the door closed behind him. Lin Mei ate the hardtack slowly, letting each piece soften in her mouth before swallowing. The dried meat was tough and heavily salted, but it was food, and her body welcomed it desperately. When she'd finished, she lay back in the straw and stared up at the dark beams of the stable ceiling. One night, she thought. He gave me one night. Tomorrow, I'll have to prove myself all over again. But for now, she was out of the wind, out of the cold. And for the first time in 6 days, she could close her eyes without wondering if she'd wake up. Sleep took her like a stone, dropping into deep water. She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the gaps in the stable walls and the sound of Gideon moving around outside. Her body felt like it had been beaten with clubs, every muscle stiff, every joint aching in protest. Lin Mei pushed herself upright slowly, biting back a groan. Through the stable door, she could see Gideon at the woodpile, working the axe with the easy rhythm of long practice. He'd already been up for hours, she realized. The man moved like someone who existed in a state of constant industry, never still, never resting. She stood carefully, testing her weight on feet that throbbed with each step. The cloth wrappings were stained dark with old blood. She'd need to wash them, find something better. When she emerged from the stable, Gideon didn't look up from his work. "Pump's still where it was," he said. "You want breakfast? There's a pot on the stove. Help yourself." Lin Mei blinked. She'd expected to be dismissed, sent back onto the trail with maybe a piece of bread if she was lucky. "I can stay?" Didn't say that. He sank the axe into a log, splitting it cleanly. Said, "You can have breakfast. After that, we'll see." She made her way to the cabin, moving carefully on her damaged feet. Inside, the space was Spartan and meticulously organized. An iron stove in the corner, still radiating heat from the morning fire. A rough table with 2 chairs. Shelves lined with supplies, flour, salt, dried beans, coffee. Furs and hides hanging from the rafters. Everything clean, everything in its place. The pot on the stove held a thin porridge, already cooling. Lin Mei found a bowl and spoon on the shelf, served herself a small portion, and ate standing up, studying the kitchen with the professional assessment of someone who'd spent a lifetime cooking. The ingredients were basic, functional. There was no art here, no consideration for anything beyond fuel for the body, but there could be. An idea began to form in the back of her mind. She washed the bowl carefully, dried it, and returned it to its exact spot on the shelf. Then she went back outside. Gideon had moved on to checking the trap lines that extended into the forest behind the cabin. She watched him work, efficient, methodical, wasting no motion. When he returned carrying 3 rabbits and a grouse, she was waiting by the woodpile. "I can do more than haul wood," she said. He stopped, eyeing her skeptically. "That's so. I was a cook in San Francisco for 32 years. She gestured toward the cabin. "That porridge on your stove? It will keep you alive, but I can make food that does more than that." "Don't need fancy cooking," Gideon said flatly. "I'm not talking about fancy." Lin Mei stepped closer, holding his gaze despite the intimidation of his size and his coldness. "I'm talking about food that makes you want to come back to the table. Food that reminds you life is more than just survival." He stared at her for a long moment, and she couldn't read anything in his expression. Then he held up one of the rabbits. "You make something worth eating out of this," he said, "and we'll talk about you staying another night." It wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. Lin Mei took the rabbit, feeling the weight of it, the still warm body. "I'll need access to your kitchen, and whatever supplies you have. Take what you need, but you waste anything, you're done." She nodded and carried the rabbit inside. Gideon watched her go, then shook his head slightly and returned to his work. Lin Mei stood at Gideon's rough wooden counter and took stock of what she had to work with. The rabbit, freshly killed and still needing to be dressed. A shelf with flour, salt, dried beans, a small amount of sugar, coffee. Some wrinkled potatoes in a bin. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters. She recognized sage and what might be wild thyme, a crock of lard. Another of what looked like bacon fat. And her tin box. She opened it carefully, revealing the small cloth packets inside. Star anise, cassia bark, Sichuan peppercorn, dried ginger root, white pepper, a small amount of 5-spice powder. These were the flavors of home, of the kitchen she'd built with Wei, the scents that could transform simple ingredients into something memorable. She'd never cooked for a man like Gideon before, someone who'd probably lived on hardtack and jerky and whatever he could shoot. Someone who measured food by function, not pleasure. But she'd spent 3 decades reading people through their appetites, learning what they needed even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. This man needed to remember he was human. Lin Mei set to work. First, she dressed the rabbit with quick, practiced movements, a skill learned from watching the hunters who'd sold to her restaurant. The skin came away cleanly. She sectioned the meat carefully, wasting nothing, setting aside the offal and bones for stock. Then she built up the fire in the stove, adjusting the damper until she had the right level of heat. She rendered some of the bacon fat in Gideon's heavy iron pan, then browned the rabbit pieces until they developed a deep golden crust. The smell began to fill the cabin, rich and savory. While the meat seared, she diced 2 of the potatoes and pulled apart the dried beans she'd set to soak in water. She found an onion in the stores, beginning to sprout but still usable, and chopped it fine. Into the pot it all went. The browned rabbit, the vegetables, water from the pump, a careful pinch of salt. Then she reached for her spices. Not too much. Western palates, she'd learned long ago, could be overwhelmed by the flavors that felt like home to her. But a small piece of star anise, a few Sichuan peppercorns, a thin slice of dried ginger, these would deepen the stew, add complexity without announcing themselves. She added the sage and thyme from Gideon's rafters, balancing the eastern and western flavors until they wove together into something new. The stew needed time. She set it to simmer, checking it periodically, adjusting the heat, skimming the surface. While it cooked, she took the rabbit bones and made a quick stock, then used some of the flour to make simple dumplings that she'd drop in during the final half hour. The cabin filled with warmth and fragrance. Through the window, she could see Gideon working in the yard, stretching pelts on frames. He didn't look toward the cabin, but she noticed he'd moved his work closer than usual, close enough to catch the scent of what she was making. 3 hours later, as the afternoon light began to slant through the windows, Lin Mei ladled 2 portions into bowls. The rabbit had cooked until it was falling off the bone tender. The vegetables had broken down into a thick, rich gravy. The dumplings floated on top, light and steaming. She set both bowls on the table and went to the door. "It's ready," she called out. Gideon straightened from his work, wiped his hands on his pants, and walked to the cabin with the same unreadable expression he'd worn all day. He stepped inside, and she saw his nose twitch slightly as the full force of the aroma hit him. "Sit," Lin Mei said, gesturing to the table. He sat slowly, eyeing the bowl in front of him with something between suspicion and curiosity. She sat across from him and waited. Gideon picked up the spoon, scooped up some of the stew, and brought it to his mouth. Lin Mei watched his face carefully. His eyes closed. Just for a moment. Then opened again, and something had shifted in them. A crack in the armor, a flash of something raw and unguarded. He took another spoonful. Then another. He ate without speaking, working through the bowl with steady determination. When he reached the bottom, he set the spoon down and sat back. The silence stretched between them. "My mother used to make rabbit stew," he said finally, his voice rough. "Nothing like this, but the smell, it reminded me of being in a kitchen where someone gave a damn." It was the most personal thing he'd said to her. Lin Mei nodded slowly. "Food can do that, carry us back to places we thought we'd lost." Gideon looked at her directly for the first time, really looked at her, not as a burden or a stranger, but as a person. "You can stay," he said, "long as you keep cooking like that. I'll hunt, you'll cook. We split the work otherwise. You get the stable for now, but I'll clear out the storage room and back, make it livable." "That's generous," Lin Mei said carefully. "It's practical," he corrected. "I eat better, I work better. You get shelter, fair trade." It wasn't warmth, it wasn't friendship, but it was acceptance in its own blunt way. "Fair trade," Lin Mei agreed. She extended her hand across the table. After a moment's hesitation, Gideon shook it. His grip was calloused and strong, but careful not to crush her smaller hand. "Rules," he said, releasing her. "You stay out of my business, I stay out of yours. You don't touch my traps, my guns, or my private stores. You cook, clean the kitchen, help with the basic work around here. Anything else needs discussing first." "Understood. And no questions about why I'm up here alone. That's not open for conversation." Lin Mei met his eyes steadily. "I won't ask about your past if you don't ask about mine." Something almost like respect flickered across his face. "Deal." The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Gideon rose before dawn, checked his trap lines, and returned with whatever game the mountain provided. Lin Mei transformed his kills into meals that made the Stark cabin smell like a home. She learned his preferences. He liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint, preferred his meat well browned, and had an unexpected fondness for the dumplings she made from the simplest ingredients. In return, he cleared the storage room, installed a small iron stove to keep it warm, and built her a simple bed frame from pine. He brought her a pair of boots that had belonged to someone else, he didn't say who, that fit well enough with extra socks. They worked side by side in a silence that gradually became comfortable rather than tense. Lin Mei learned the patterns of mountain life, how to read the weather in the behavior of birds, how to preserve meat for the lean times, how to render fat and make soap from lion ashes. Gideon learned that the old woman was stronger than she looked, that she never complained, never asked for special treatment, and could haul water or split kindling with a determination that bordered on stubborn. They spoke little, but the silence between them was no longer empty. One evening, as they sat at the table after dinner, Gideon pushed his empty bowl away and said, "There's a trader comes through once a month, Briggs Talon. He'll be here in a few days." "Should I prepare extra food?" Lin May asked. "Probably." Gideon's expression darkened slightly. "Briggs is difficult, loud, crude, but he brings supplies I can't get otherwise, and he pays fair for pelts." "You don't like him." "I tolerate him." Gideon stood, carrying his bowl to the wash basin. "Just warning you, he'll probably say something stupid. Ignore him." Lin May nodded, filing the warning away. 3 days later, she was in the kitchen working on a venison roast when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Gideon stepped out of the cabin, and she watched through the window as a large man on a stocky horse rode into the clearing. Briggs Talon was everything Gideon had implied, and more. Broad and barrel-chested, with a wild red beard and a voice that carried like a bullhorn. He dismounted with the heavy thud of a man who'd never learned to move quietly. "Rourke," he bellowed, "good to see you haven't frozen to death or fallen off a cliff." "Briggs," Gideon's tone was flat. "You're early." "Found a good route through the pass, saved 3 days." Briggs began unloading sacks from his horse, then stopped, his nose lifting like a dog catching a scent. "What in the hell is that smell?" "Dinner," Gideon said shortly. "Since when do you cook anything that doesn't taste like boot leather?" Briggs turned toward the cabin, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Lin May through the window. Well, well, you got yourself a woman up here." "I have a cook," Gideon corrected coldly, "who works for room and board. Nothing else is your business." But Briggs was already striding toward the cabin, shouldering the door open without knocking. "Ma'am," he said, sweeping off his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Briggs Talon, at your service. And might I say, whatever you're making smells like heaven itself." Lin May straightened from the stove, studying the trader with the same calm assessment she'd once used on drunk customers in her restaurant. "Mr. Talon," she said politely, "I'm Lin May. The food will be ready in an hour." "An hour?" Briggs laughed. "Rourke, you mind if I wait? I've been eating my own cooking for 2 weeks, and I'd sell my soul for something that doesn't taste like saddle leather." Gideon appeared in the doorway, his expression clearly indicating he'd prefer Briggs to leave immediately, but Lin May spoke first. "You're welcome to stay for dinner, Mr. Talon. There's plenty." Briggs grinned. "A woman with manners and cooking skills. Rourke, you're living better than you deserve. Touch anything that isn't yours," Gideon said quietly, "and I'll break your hands." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Briggs's grin didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition that Gideon meant every word. "Understood," he said lightly. "I'll just wait outside and admire your hospitality." He left, and Gideon turned to Lin May with something that might have been concern. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Do what?" "Invite him to stay." Lin May returned to her work, turning the roast in its pan. "He's crude, but he's also your only contact with the outside world, and I've dealt with far worse than loud traders." Gideon studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Still, you don't owe him courtesy." "No," she agreed, "but I owe you a peaceful business relationship, and feeding him costs us nothing but time." Something flickered across Gideon's face. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. But he said nothing more, just returned outside to finalize his trade with Briggs. An hour later, the three of them sat at the table while Lin May served the venison roast with roasted potatoes and wild greens she'd found growing near the creek. Briggs ate like a man who'd forgotten what real food tasted like, shoveling it in with barely a pause for breath. "Ma'am," he said around a mouthful of venison, "this is the best goddamn meal I've had in 5 years, maybe 10. "Thank you," Lin May said. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" "San Francisco. I ran a restaurant." "And you ended up here?" Briggs shook his head in amazement. "That's like going from a palace to a cave." "Sometimes caves are safer than palaces," Lin May said quietly. Briggs caught something in her tone and had the rare wisdom to let it drop. Instead, he turned to Gideon. "You know what you've got here, Rourke? A treasure. If word gets out that there's a cook this good up in the mountains, you'll have every trapper and miner in 3 territories beating down your door." Which is why word won't get out, Gideon said flatly. Of course, of course. Briggs wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. But I'll tell you what, I've got a haunch of bear meat on my pack horse. Toughest, meanest old bastard I've ever seen. I was going to try to salt it, but it'll probably still be tough as rope. He leaned forward, eyes glinting with mischief. I'll wager you a month's worth of flour that your cook here can't make that bear meat edible. Lin Mei felt Gideon stiffen beside her. She doesn't need to prove anything to you, Gideon said, his voice dangerous. It's all right, Lin Mei said calmly. She looked at Briggs directly. What do I get when I win? Briggs laughed, surprised and delighted. Confidence! I like that. All right, you make that bear tender enough to chew, and I'll throw in the flour plus a sack of dried apples and whatever else I've got that you might use in that kitchen. And when you lose, Lin Mei said, you tell every trader you meet that Gideon Rourke is not to be bothered by visitors. His privacy is worth more than your entertainment. Briggs's eyebrows rose. He glanced at Gideon, who was staring at Lin Mei with an expression of absolute astonishment. Well now, Briggs said slowly, you drive a hard bargain, ma'am. Do we have a deal? He extended his hand across the table. Deal. Lin Mei shook it firmly. Gideon said nothing, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy with questions he wouldn't ask. Briggs stood, suddenly energized. I'll get that meat. We'll settle this tomorrow. Give you time to work whatever magic you've got. He headed for the door, then paused and looked back at Gideon. You're a lucky man, Rourke. Whether you know it or not. Then he was gone, his boots crunching across the yard toward his horse. In the silence that followed, Gideon finally spoke. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Accept his wager. Defend my privacy. Yes, I did, Lin Mei said simply. Why? She began clearing the table, stacking the dishes with practiced efficiency. Because this is the first place I've felt safe since my husband died, she said without looking at him. And I won't let some loud traitor turn it into a spectacle. Gideon stood frozen for a moment, processing her words. Then he picked up his own plate and carried it to the wash basin. That bear meat, he said. It really will be tough. Briggs wasn't exaggerating. I know. You confident you can do it? Lin Mei finally met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she allowed herself a small smile. Mr. Rourke, I once made duck feet tender enough for a banker's wife who had 3 teeth. I can handle bear. The corner of Gideon's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. All right then, he said. Let's see what you can do. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air smelled of pine and coming autumn. And inside the small cabin carved into the mountainside, 2 people who'd learned to survive alone began, slowly, carefully, to build something that looked like trust. The bear haunch arrived at dawn, slung over Briggs's shoulder like a sack of stones. Lin Mei stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching as the trader dropped the massive piece of meat onto Gideon's work table with a heavy thud that shook the wooden surface. There she is, Briggs announced, stepping back with his arms crossed. Meanest black bear I've tracked in 5 years. Took 2 shots to bring him down, and he still tried to take my leg off. He grinned at Lin Mei. Good luck making that chewable, ma'am. I'll be back tomorrow evening to see if you've worked a miracle. Lin Mei approached the table slowly, examining the meat with a practiced eye. The haunch was enormous, easily 40 pounds, and the muscle fibers were dense and dark, almost purple in the early light. She pressed her thumb against the flesh. It resisted like iron. Briggs was right. This would be a challenge. Tomorrow evening, she confirmed. And if you can't do it, Briggs added cheerfully, no shame in admitting defeat. Bear's a bastard to cook, even in the best kitchens. She'll do it, Gideon said from behind her. His voice carried a certainty that surprised them both. Briggs raised his eyebrows, then shrugged. Well then, I'll leave you to it. Got some trading to do down at Cooper's camp. Should be back by sunset tomorrow. He tipped his hat to Lin Mei. Looking forward to being proven wrong, ma'am. He mounted his horse and rode off, his laughter echoing across the clearing. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Gideon moved to stand beside Lin Mei, both of them staring down at the massive haunch. You really think you can do this? He asked quietly. I don't know, she admitted, but I'm going to try. She spent the rest of the morning studying the meat, planning her approach. The problem with bear, especially old, tough bear, was that the muscle fibers were thick and dense, designed to power a creature that could tear apart logs and dig through frozen ground. Standard cooking would only make it tougher, squeezing out moisture and leaving behind something closer to leather than food. She needed to break down those fibers slowly, gently, over many hours. And she needed flavors strong enough to penetrate deep into the meat, transforming it from the inside out. Lin Mei began by trimming away the thickest sections of silver skin and fat, setting them aside for rendering. Then she scored the meat deeply in a crosshatch pattern, creating channels for her marinade to penetrate. From her spice box, she pulled out ingredients she rarely used all at once: star anise, Sichuan peppercorns, dried ginger, cassia bark. To these she added Gideon's stores, salt, black pepper, the dried sage and thyme from the rafters. She crushed everything together in a wooden bowl, releasing the oils and aromatics. Then came the liquid base. She had no rice wine, no soy sauce, no shaoxing, the ingredients she would have used in San Francisco. Instead, she improvised. Strong coffee for depth and bitterness. A splash of vinegar from Gideon's preserving supplies. Rendered bacon fat for richness. A spoonful of the precious sugar to balance and caramelize. She worked the marinade into every cut and crevice of the meat, massaging it deep into the flesh, then wrapped the entire haunch in cheesecloth and set it in the coolest corner of the cabin. "It needs to rest," she told Gideon, who'd been watching from the doorway. "Overnight at least. The spices need time to work." "And then?" "Then I cook it low and slow, maybe 12 hours, maybe more, until the meat stops fighting and surrenders." Gideon nodded slowly. "You talk about cooking like it's a battle." "Sometimes it is," Lin Mei said, washing her hands in the basin. "You're trying to transform something wild into something nourishing. That takes strategy, patience, and respect for what you're working with." "Sounds like trapping," Gideon observed. "Maybe all work is the same at its core," she said. "Understanding your opponent, using the right tools, knowing when to push and when to wait." That afternoon, while the meat rested, Lin Mei turned her attention to preparing everything else she'd need. She rendered more fat, carefully skimming and straining it. She sorted through Gideon's root vegetables, selecting the ones that would hold up to long cooking: carrots, turnips, the last of the potatoes. She picked through the dried beans, discarding any that looked questionable. Gideon worked nearby, repairing a section of the stable roof that had started to leak. But she noticed he kept finding reasons to come back to the cabin, checking his supplies, refilling his water jug, sharpening a knife that probably didn't need sharpening. He was curious, she realized, about the process, about whether she could actually pull this off. That evening, over a simple dinner of cornbread and leftover stew, Gideon spoke. "Briggs is an ass," he said abruptly. "But he's not wrong about word spreading. If you make that bear edible, he'll talk about it. Traders gossip worse than washerwomen." "I know," Lin Mei said. "You'll have people showing up here, miners, trappers, maybe worse, looking for a hot meal and a cook they can exploit." "Is that what you think you're doing?" she asked quietly. "Exploiting me?" Gideon's head snapped up, his eyes sharp. "No, we have an arrangement, fair trade. Then why would I leave for someone else's arrangement?" He studied her for a long moment. "Because someone might offer you better. A real room instead of a storage space. Money instead of just shelter." Lin Mei set down her spoon carefully. "Mr. Rourke, I've had better. I had my own business, my own kitchen, a real home. And when my husband died, all of those people who smiled and ate my food, they turned their backs the moment I couldn't pay rent." Her voice remained steady, but something hard glinted in her eyes. "I'll take honest silence over false friendship any day. And I'll take a storage room where I'm valued over a palace where I'm tolerated." Gideon looked away first, his jaw working. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "Just wanted you to know you've got choices, that's all." "I appreciate that," she said, "but I've made my choice." The next morning, Lin Mei woke before dawn and immediately checked the meat. The marinade had done its work. The surface had darkened, and when she pressed it, the flesh gave slightly, the aromatics having begun their slow penetration. She built up the fire in the stove, then prepared her cooking vessel, Gideon's largest iron pot, scrubbed until it gleamed. Into the bottom went a layer of fat, then a bed of rough-cut vegetables. She lowered the bear haunch onto this foundation, surrounding it with more vegetables, then poured in water mixed with some of the leftover marinade. The lid went on, sealed tight with a paste of flour and water around the edges to trap every bit of moisture and heat. Then came the waiting. She adjusted the fire constantly, keeping the temperature low and steady. Too hot, and the meat would seize. Too cool, and it wouldn't break down. It was a dance she'd performed 1,000 times with different ingredients, but never with steaks quite like these. The hours crept by. Around midday, Gideon came in from checking his traps. He'd caught 2 rabbits and a fox, which he set about skinning and cleaning. The work was brutal and efficient, his knife moving with the confidence of long practice. "How's it going?" he asked, nodding toward the stove. "Hard to say. Won't know until I open it." "When will that be?" "Not for hours yet. The meat will tell me when it's ready." Gideon paused in his work. "How will you know?" "The smell changes," Lin May explained. "Right now it's still fighting. You can smell the wildness in it, that gamey edge. When it's ready, that smell will soften, become something richer, deeper, sweet even." "You can smell all that?" "After 30 years, yes." She adjusted the damper slightly. "Cooking is about listening, to the fire, to the food, to the way things change when they're ready." Gideon returned to his skinning, but she could tell he was thinking about what she'd said. By late afternoon, the cabin had filled with an aroma that made them both stop what they were doing. It was deep and complex. The sharp bite of the spices mellowed into something warm and inviting, mixed with the earthy sweetness of the vegetables and the rich, almost wine-like scent of meat that had been coaxed into surrender. Lin May lifted the lid carefully, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam. The bear meat had transformed. The surface, once dark and resistant, now glistened with rendered fat and spices. When she inserted a long fork, it slid in with almost no resistance. "It's done," she said quietly. She lifted the haunch out carefully, setting it on a platter. The meat was so tender now that it threatened to fall apart at the slightest touch. Using 2 forks, she began to pull it into smaller portions, the fibers separating easily, steaming in the cool air. Gideon stood at her shoulder, staring. "I've never seen bear meat look like that," he said. "Try it," Lin May offered, holding out a small piece on a fork. He took it cautiously and placed it in his mouth. His eyes widened. "It's—" He chewed slowly, carefully, as if trying to understand what he was tasting. "It doesn't even taste like bear. It's almost sweet, but not sweet. And the spices, I can taste them, but they don't overpower the meat." "That's the balance," Lin May said, relief flooding through her. "Everything working together instead of fighting." Gideon took another piece, then another, eating with the focused attention of a man discovering something entirely new. "Briggs is going to lose his mind," he said finally. "Briggs is going to lose his wager," Lin May corrected, unable to suppress a small smile. They spent the next hour preparing for the trader's arrival. Lin May arranged the pulled bear meat in a large serving bowl, then made a quick pan sauce from the cooking liquid, reducing it down with a little flour until it was thick and glossy. She heated the vegetables separately, seasoning them with salt and pepper. There was enough to feed 6 people, more than enough to prove her point. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Briggs arrived in high spirits, dismounting with his usual heavy thud and striding toward the cabin with a grin already in place. "Well," he called out, "did that old bear defeat you, ma'am, or should I start counting out my supplies?" "Come see for yourself," Gideon said from the doorway. Briggs stepped inside, and Lin May watched his expression change as the smell hit him. The grin faltered. His nose lifted, almost unconsciously, following the scent like a hunting dog. "What in the He moved closer to the table where she'd laid out the meal. "That's the bear?" "That's the bear," Lin May confirmed. "It looks like pulled pork." "Try it," she invited. Briggs sat down heavily, still staring at the food with disbelief. He took a fork and speared a generous portion of the meat, brought it to his mouth. The silence that followed was profound. Briggs chewed slowly, his eyes closing. Then he took another bite, and another. He reached for the vegetables, the sauce, tasting everything with the methodical attention of a man trying to understand how something impossible had just become real. Finally, he set down his fork and looked at Lin May. "Ma'am," he said quietly, all traces of his earlier bravado gone. I've eaten in fancy hotels in Denver and San Francisco. I've had Thanksgiving dinner at the governor's mansion, and this, he gestured at the bowl, this is the best thing I've ever put in my mouth. Does that mean I win? Lin May asked. Briggs laughed, a genuine sound of pure amazement. Win? Ma'am, you didn't just win, you destroyed me. That bear was so tough, I was going to turn it into boot soles. He stood and walked to the door, returning a moment later with a heavy sack. Flour, as promised, and the dried apples. And he reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bag. Sugar, real sugar, not the brown stuff, and some salt that's actually white instead of gray. He set everything on the table, then met her eyes directly. And I'll keep my other promise, too. Any trader asks about Gideon Rourke, I'll tell them he values his privacy and isn't interested in visitors. You have my word. Thank you, Mr. Talon, Lin May said. Thank you. He sat back down and helped himself to another generous portion. I hope you don't mind if I finish this. Seems criminal to waste it. Eat what you like, Gideon said, taking his own seat at the table. They ate together in companionable silence, the kind that comes when food is good enough to make conversation unnecessary. Briggs went back for thirds, then fourths, groaning with satisfaction. You know what the real crime is? He said eventually, pushing his plate away with obvious reluctance. That this meal happened in a cabin on a mountain where nobody will ever know about it. You could make a fortune in any city, ma'am. I had a restaurant in a city? Lin May said quietly. I'm not interested in going back. Something in her tone made Briggs look at her more carefully. Fair enough, he said. Man's got to choose his own path. Or woman's, in your case. He stood, patting his stomach. I'll be heading out. Got a long ride back to the trading post. But as he reached the door, he paused and turned back to Gideon. You're a lucky bastard, Rourke. You know that, right? I'm beginning to, Gideon said. After Briggs left, the cabin felt suddenly quiet. Lin May began clearing the table, and Gideon helped, the two of them working in their now familiar rhythm. You didn't have to defend my privacy like that, Gideon said as they washed dishes, making that part of the wager. Yes, I did. Why? Lin May was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the wash water. Because I understand wanting to be left alone, and because, she paused, choosing her words carefully, because this place feels safe. I don't want it to change. Gideon dried a plate slowly, not looking at her. Nothing stays the same forever. No, she agreed, but we can protect what we have for as long as possible. He set the dried plate on the shelf with unusual care. You keep saying we. Is that wrong? No, Gideon said quietly. It's just, I haven't been part of a we in a long time. Lin May turned to look at him directly. Neither have I, not since Wei died. Wei was your husband? For 32 years. Gideon nodded slowly, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared loss, of understanding what it meant to suddenly be alone after years of partnership. I was married once too, he said abruptly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised her. Long time ago, Sarah. She died in childbirth. The baby too. Lin May's hands stilled in the water. I'm sorry. It's been 14 years. His voice was flat, carefully controlled. I came up here after. Couldn't stand being in town, around people who kept looking at me with pity. Figured if I was going to be alone, might as well do it somewhere nobody could bother me about it. And has it helped? Lin May asked gently. Being alone? Gideon was quiet for a long time. It helped me survive, he said finally. But I'm starting to think surviving and living might be different things. He set down the dish towel and walked to the door, stepping out into the cooling evening air. Lin May finished the dishes alone, giving him space to sit with whatever memories she'd stirred up. But later, when she brought him a cup of coffee on the porch, he accepted it with a quiet thank you that held more meaning than the simple words suggested. They sat together in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the mountain settling for the night, the creek running over stones, the wind moving through the pines, the distant call of a night bird. The garden, Gideon said suddenly. I've been thinking about putting in a proper garden come spring. Herbs, vegetables, maybe some of those spices you use. You'd know what to plant better than I would. Lin Mei felt something warm unfold in her chest. A garden meant permanence. It meant planning for a future that included her. I'd like that, she said. They sat in silence for a while longer, and when Lin Mei finally stood to go to her room, Gideon spoke again. That thing you said earlier about honest silence being better than false friendship. Yes? I understand that, he said. Better than you might think, Lin Mei nodded. I know you do. That's why I'm still here. She left him there on the porch, the stars beginning to emerge overhead, and made her way to her small room. It was warm from the stove, and through the thin walls she could hear the ordinary sounds of Gideon moving around the cabin, banking the fire, checking the locks. The sounds of someone who was no longer quite as alone as he'd been. The next few weeks passed in deepening autumn. The aspens on the mountainside turned gold, then shed their leaves in shimmering waterfalls. The air grew sharper, carrying the promise of winter. Gideon's trapping increased as the animals grew their winter coats, and Lin Mei found herself working with an ever greater variety of game: elk, deer, rabbit, even a mountain lion that Gideon had taken after it started threatening his trap lines. She expanded her repertoire, learning to work with what the mountain provided. Wild mushrooms that Gideon showed her how to identify. Berries she dried for winter. Roots and tubers that could be roasted or boiled or turned into flour. The tin box of spices became less essential as she learned to coax flavor from the ingredients around her. She still used them, but sparingly now, mixing Eastern and Western techniques into something uniquely her own. One morning she woke to find the first snow had fallen during the night, a light dusting that made the world look fresh and clean. Gideon was already up, standing in the doorway of the cabin, coffee in hand, looking out at the transformed landscape. Winter comes early this high up, he said when she joined him. We've got maybe a month before the pass closes completely. After that, we're on our own until spring. Will we have enough supplies? Lin Mei asked. Should. I've been hunting extra, and you've preserved more than I usually manage. He glanced at her. You ever been through a mountain winter? No. It's hard, he said bluntly. Weeks where you can't go outside because the snow's too deep. Temperatures that'll freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth. Cabin fever that makes people crazy. Are you trying to scare me? I'm trying to prepare you. He turned to face her fully. If you want to go back down before the pass closes, now's the time. Briggs is making one more run next week. He'd take you to the trading post, help you find work somewhere warmer. Lin Mei looked out at the snow-dusted pines, the mountains rising stark and beautiful against the pale morning sky. Do you want me to go? She asked quietly. No, Gideon said immediately. Then, more carefully, but what I want isn't what matters. You've got to decide for yourself. I've already decided, Lin Mei said. I'm staying. Something in Gideon's expression shifted. Relief, gratitude, something deeper that he quickly masked. All right then, he said. We'll need to get serious about winter prep. I'll show you what needs doing. They spent the next week in intense preparation. Gideon brought down a huge elk, and together they butchered it, preserving every ounce of meat through smoking, salting, and rendering. Lin Mei made sausages using techniques Wei had taught her, mixing the ground meat with spices and herbs, stuffing them into cleaned intestines to hang in the cold storage. They reinforced the cabin's chinking, filling every gap where wind might penetrate. Stacked firewood until it formed walls on 3 sides of the clearing. Checked and double-checked every tool, every trap, every supply they'd need to make it through until spring. When Briggs made his final run, he brought extra flour, coffee, and a few luxuries: real tea, dried fruit, a small bottle of whiskey. For medicinal purposes, he said with a wink, handing the bottle to Gideon, and for when the walls start closing in. He also brought news from the lower settlements. There's talk of a hard winter coming, he said. Old-timers are saying it'll be the worst in 20 years. You two be careful up here. We'll manage, Gideon said. Briggs looked between them, something thoughtful in his expression. You know, when I first saw you here, he said to Lin Mei, I figured you'd last maybe a week before you ran back to civilization. But you've got the look now. What look? She asked. The mountain look? Like you belong here. He tipped his hat. Take care of each other. I'll see you both in spring. After he left, the cabin felt more isolated than ever. Lin Mei stood in the doorway, watching the empty trail where Briggs had disappeared. Having second thoughts? Gideon asked from behind her. No, she said. Just realizing how alone we really are now. Does that scare you? Lin Mei considered the question honestly. A little, but mostly it feels peaceful, like the world has narrowed down to just what's essential. That's the mountain, Gideon said. It strips away everything that doesn't matter, leaves you with just the truth. And what's the truth? Lin Mei asked, turning to face him. Gideon met her eyes, and for once his expression was completely open, all the carefully maintained walls lowered. The truth is, I'm glad you're here, he said simply. The truth is, this cabin feels like a home again, instead of just a place to survive. And the truth is, I haven't felt this alive in 14 years. Lin Mei felt her throat tighten with emotion. The truth is, I feel the same way. They stood there in the doorway, the first snow beginning to fall again, gentle and steady. Come on, Gideon said eventually, his voice gruff but warm. Let's get inside before we freeze. I'll teach you how to play chess. Going to need something to do with all those long winter nights. Lin Mei followed him inside, and as he closed the door against the cold, she realized she wasn't afraid of the winter at all. Whatever challenges it brought, they would face them together, and that made all the difference. The chess lessons became their evening ritual as November deepened into December. Gideon carved the pieces himself from pine and darker walnut, each one simple but carefully shaped, pawns like small towers, knights with suggested horse heads, a king and queen distinguished by their height. Lin Mei learned quickly, her mind sharp despite her initial protests that she was too old for new games. You're thinking 3 moves ahead already, Gideon observed one night, watching her deliberate over the board. Most people never get past one. And in the kitchen, you always have to think ahead, she said, moving her knight to threaten his bishop. What needs to come off the heat? What needs to go on? What's about to burn? It's the same kind of planning. Everything comes back to cooking with you, Gideon said, but there was warmth in his voice. Everything comes back to trapping with you, she countered, and he conceded the point with a slight smile. The first real storm hit 3 days before Christmas. Not that they were tracking the holiday particularly, but Gideon kept a calendar scratched into a piece of wood, marking off the days. It started as a whisper of wind, then built to a roar that shook the cabin's walls. Snow fell so thick they couldn't see the stable from the window. The temperature plummeted until frost formed on the inside of the glass, creating intricate patterns that Lin Mei found herself studying during the long hours when going outside was impossible. This is just the beginning, Gideon said, standing by the window with his arms crossed. We'll probably see 3 or 4 storms like this before spring. Lin Mei was at the stove, making dumplings in broth, simple food that warmed from the inside out. How long do they usually last? 2 days? Maybe 3? Depends on the wind. He turned from the window, his expression serious. We need to talk about the stable. The horses need checking every few hours, even in this. I'll handle it, but if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, Lin Mei interrupted. But if it does, Gideon continued firmly, you need to know how to manage them, how to break ice in the water trough, how much hay to give them, how to tell if they're in distress. Then teach me now, Lin Mei said, before something forces me to learn in a crisis. So between the waves of the storm, during the brief lulls when visibility improved slightly, Gideon took her to the stable and showed her everything. How to approach the horses calmly, speaking in low tones. How to check their legs for swelling or heat. How to ration the feed to make their supplies last through winter. The horses, a sturdy gelding named Smoke and an older mare called Birch, accepted Lin Mei's presence with patient tolerance, as if understanding she was trying her best. They're good animals, Gideon said, running a hand down Smoke's neck. Saved my life more than once. A man respects his horses up here or he doesn't survive long. On the second night of the storm, the wind reached a fever pitch. Something crashed in the yard, a section of the lean-to giving way under the weight of snow. The sound brought Gideon to his feet instantly, reaching for his coat. I need to check it, he said. If the whole structure comes down, we'll lose half our winter storage. Not alone, Lin Mei said, already pulling on the oversized coat he'd given her weeks ago. If you get turned around in this wind, you'll need someone to guide you back. It's too dangerous. Which is exactly why you don't go alone, she said firmly. Tie a rope between us. I'll stay by the door while you work. If you get disoriented, you follow the rope back to me." Gideon looked like he wanted to argue, but the logic was sound and they both knew it. He retrieved a coil of rope from the storage room and tied one end around Lin May's waist, the other around his own. "Stay right by the door," he instructed. "Don't move unless I call for you. If the rope goes slack, pull it tight immediately. Understand?" "I understand." He pushed open the cabin door and the storm roared in, a wall of white and wind that stole the breath from their lungs. Gideon leaned into it, moving toward where the lean-to stood, barely visible through the blowing snow. Lin May braced herself in the doorway, feeling the rope grow taut as Gideon moved farther away. The wind screamed around her, trying to rip her from her position. Snow stung her face like thrown needles. She counted his steps by the pull of the rope. 10 feet. 15. 20. Then the rope jerked hard, nearly pulling her off her feet. "Gideon?" she shouted, but the wind tore the words away. The rope jerked again, more violently this time, and she heard a sound that made her blood freeze, a deep, splintering crack, followed by Gideon's shout of warning. Without thinking, Lin May pulled hard on the rope, hauling it hand over hand, drawing him back toward her. The resistance was enormous. He was caught on something, or weighed down, she couldn't tell which. "Gideon!" she screamed again. Another pull, and suddenly he was there, stumbling toward her out of the white chaos. His coat was torn, and blood ran from a gash on his forehead where something had struck him. Together they fell back into the cabin, and Lin May slammed the door shut behind them, throwing her weight against it as the wind tried to tear it open again. Gideon collapsed onto the floor, breathing hard. "What happened?" Lin May demanded, already moving to examine his head wound. "The whole north side gave way," he gasped. "Beam came down, nearly took my skull off. Would have, if I hadn't heard it crack." The gash was deep, bleeding freely. Lin May grabbed clean cloth and pressed it against the wound, applying firm pressure. "You need stitches," she said. "Can you do it?" "I've sewn up plenty of fish," she said grimly. "I suppose a man can't be that different." She made him sit at the table while she gathered what she needed. Needle and thread boiled in water for cleanliness, more cloth for bandaging, the bottle of whiskey Briggs had left them. "This is going to hurt," she warned, threading the needle. "Everything hurts up here," Gideon said. "Just do it." She cleaned the wound with whiskey. He hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away, then began stitching with small, careful movements. Her hands were steady, each stitch placed precisely, drawing the torn skin back together. Gideon sat motionless, his jaw clenched, knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. "Talk to me," Lin May said quietly as she worked. "Keep your mind elsewhere." "What should I talk about?" "Anything. Tell me about Sarah." His eyes opened, surprised. "Why?" "Because you never speak of her. And because silence isn't always strength, sometimes it's just weight you carry alone." For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he began to speak. "She was a school teacher," he said, his voice rough. "Came west from Boston to teach in a mining town. I was working timber then, floating logs down to the mills. First time I saw her, she was trying to fix the schoolhouse roof by herself, determined as hell even though she clearly had no idea what she was doing." "Did you help her?" Lin May asked, placing another stitch. "Eventually, after I stopped laughing." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She gave me the most furious look, then climbed down and demanded I show her the right way to do it. Said if she was going to live in the wilderness, she needed to know how to fix things herself." Smart woman. Smartest person I ever knew. His voice dropped. When she got pregnant, she was so happy. Planned everything out, bought fabric to make baby clothes, picked names. Boy was going to be Daniel, girl was going to be Rose. Lin May's hands stilled for just a moment, then continued their work. "The midwife said everything was going fine at first," Gideon continued, staring at nothing. Then something went wrong. Sarah started bleeding and couldn't stop. The baby, Daniel, came out blue. Neither of them ever drew a proper breath. "I'm sorry," Lin May whispered. "I buried them together, her holding him. Then I sold everything, bought supplies, and came up here. Figured if I couldn't save them, at least I could make sure nobody else ever had to watch me fail again." Lin May tied off the last stitch and cut the thread. "Surviving something terrible isn't the same as failing. Feels the same most days." She began bandaging the wound, wrapping clean cloth around his head. "Wei died of a fever," she said quietly. Started as a cough, turned into pneumonia. The doctors said there was nothing to be done, but I kept thinking if I'd just noticed sooner, made him rest more, forced him to see someone earlier. She secured the bandage with practiced efficiency. We carry guilt for the things we couldn't control. It's what humans do, but it doesn't make the guilt true. Gideon looked up at her, something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. How did you stop blaming yourself? I haven't, Lin Mei admitted. Not completely, but I've learned to live with it, and I've learned that punishing yourself doesn't honor the people you've lost. Living does. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, two people who'd been running from their grief sat together in understanding. Thank you, Gideon said finally, for the stitches, and for the rest. You're welcome. Lin Mei cleaned up the supplies, her movements brisk to hide the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. Now get some rest. That head needs to heal, and you'll be useless if you push too hard. Yes, ma'am, he said, and there was something almost like lightness in his tone. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay 4 feet deep in places, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. The damaged lean-to had completely collapsed, but most of the supplies stored there were salvageable, just buried under snow and debris. It took them 3 days to dig out and rebuild, working in short shifts to avoid frostbite. Gideon's head wound healed clean, thanks to Lin Mei's careful stitching, leaving a scar that disappeared into his hairline. Christmas came and went unmarked except for Lin Mei making a special meal, a roasted rabbit with the last of the dried apples stewed into a sauce, and dumplings that she shaped into small stars as a quiet nod to the holiday. They ate by lamplight while wind rattled the shutters, and if neither of them mentioned the significance of the day, both noticed the small gestures. Gideon had carved her a new spoon to replace the one she'd been using, smooth and perfectly balanced. Lin Mei had used precious sugar to make a small batch of candied ginger, knowing he had a weakness for sweets he rarely indulged. The gifts were exchanged without ceremony, but Lin Mei saw Gideon run his thumb over the carved spoon as if memorizing its shape, and she caught him eating the candied ginger slowly, making each piece last. January brought a cold so intense that water froze solid within minutes of being drawn from the pump. They kept the fire burning day and night, rationing wood carefully but never letting it die completely. The cabin became their entire world, a circle of warmth and survival in a landscape that had turned actively hostile. It was during these long, frozen weeks that Lin Mei learned the true meaning of cabin fever. The walls seemed to press in. The routine became suffocating, and the endless white outside the windows played tricks on the mind. She found herself snapping at Gideon over trivial things, the way he scraped his bowl, the sound of his knife on the whetstone, the simple fact of his presence in a space that suddenly felt too small for two people. He responded with the same irritability, criticizing the way she stacked firewood, questioning whether she was using too much flour, retreating into long silences that felt like walls between them. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where neither had spoken a word, Lin Mei stood abruptly and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" Gideon asked, his voice sharp with concern. "Outside, I need air. It's 20 below out there." "I don't care," she said, pulling on her coat. "I need space or I'm going to scream." She stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her, and stood in the shocking cold, breathing hard. The air burned her lungs, but it was a clean burn, a pain that cleared her head. After a moment, the door opened, and Gideon stepped out beside her. He didn't say anything, just stood there in the brutal cold, his breath forming clouds. "I'm sorry," Lin Mei said finally. "This is harder than I expected." "Winter madness," Gideon said quietly. "Happens to everyone up here eventually. You start to feel like you're trapped, like the walls are closing in. Makes people crazy, makes them mean. How do you deal with it?" "Badly, usually." He was quiet for a moment. "But this year, it's different. This year, when I feel it coming on, I remember that I'm not alone anymore. And that helps." Lin Mei looked at him, this man who'd taken her in when he had every reason to turn her away, who'd shared his solitude and his space and slowly, carefully, his trust. "It helps me too," she said. "Even when I want to throw your coffee pot at your head." He laughed. A real laugh, not just a huff of air. "I'll try to scrape my bowl more quietly. And I'll try to use less flour." They stood together in the impossible cold for another moment, then went back inside where the warmth felt even more precious for having been briefly abandoned. After that, they made a point of giving each other space when the cabin fever struck. Gideon would go to the stable and spend hours with the horses, currying them with methodical patience. Lin Mei would retreat to her room with her tin of spices, sorting and resorting them, planning meals she'd make when spring finally came. And they learned to read each other's moods, to know when silence was needed and when conversation would help, when to push and when to retreat. February arrived with no lessening of the cold, but the days grew incrementally longer, and that alone was enough to lift their spirits. They could see the end now, even if it was still weeks away. One afternoon, while Gideon was checking the trap lines close to the cabin, Lin Mei was in the kitchen experimenting with their dwindling supplies. She'd found a way to make the dried beans more palatable by cooking them with rendered fat, and a touch of the molasses Briggs had included in his last delivery. She was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the approach of footsteps outside. Multiple sets, heavy and deliberate. The knock on the door made her jump. "Gideon?" she called, but there was no answer. The knock came again, harder this time. Lin Mei wiped her hands on her apron and approached the door cautiously. Through the small window, she could see 3 men standing in the yard, rough-looking and heavily armed. Her heart began to pound. She opened the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" The man in front was massive, with a scarred face and eyes that assessed her like merchandise. "Where's Rourke?" "He's checking his traps. Should be back soon." "Good. We'll wait." The man moved to push the door open wider. Lin Mei held it firm. "You can wait outside." The man's expression darkened. "That's not very friendly." "I'm not required to be friendly to strangers," Lin Mei said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "State your business or move on." "Our business is with Rourke, not some old Chinese woman," the man said, his tone turning ugly. "Now step aside." "No." Something shifted behind the man's eyes, anger flashing into violence. He reached for the door, clearly intending to force his way in. Lin Mei slammed it shut and threw the bolt, her hands shaking. Through the door, she heard cursing, then laughter. "Feisty old bird," one of the men said. "Rourke always did have interesting taste." "We'll just wait out here then," the leader called out. "Tell him Briggs Talon sends his regards, and that we want to discuss a business opportunity." Lin Mei's blood went cold. Briggs had kept his word about protecting their privacy, but these men were using his name anyway, which meant they were either lying or had done something to Briggs to get the information. She moved to the window and looked out. The men had settled themselves on the porch, making themselves comfortable, clearly in no hurry to leave. Where was Gideon? She checked the rifle mounted over the door, loaded and ready, just as he'd taught her. Then she checked the pistol he kept in the cabinet, also loaded. She'd never shot anyone before, but she understood the principle, and she understood that these men meant trouble. Another 20 minutes crawled by, each second stretching into eternity. Then she saw movement at the edge of the clearing, Gideon, returning with 3 rabbits slung over his shoulder. He stopped dead when he saw the horses, his body language shifting instantly from relaxed to alert. Through the window, Lin Mei watched him assess the situation with the quick efficiency of a man who'd survived by reading danger. His eyes found the men on the porch, counted them, evaluated their weapons. Then his gaze shifted to the cabin, searching for her. She appeared in the window briefly, just long enough for him to see she was all right. Then she pointed to the rifle she was holding and held up 3 fingers. Gideon's expression didn't change, but he gave the smallest nod of understanding. He approached the cabin slowly, deliberately, his hands visible and away from his weapons. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing, "you're on private property." The leader stood, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "Gideon Rourke, heard a lot about you. They say you're the best trapper in these mountains. They also say you found yourself a cook who can make magic with bear meat." "What do you want?" Gideon asked flatly. "Name's Carson. We represent some business interests down in the valley. Mining operations mainly. We've got workers who need feeding, and we heard you might have access to someone with special skills." Carson grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for the old woman's services." "She's not for sale," Gideon said. "Everything's for sale at the right price," Carson countered. We'll pay you $500 for her contract. That's more than a year's trapping income, Rourke, for one old woman who's probably more trouble than she's worth. Inside the cabin, Lin Mei felt her hands tighten on the rifle. She was property again, being negotiated over like goods. But Gideon's response was immediate and unequivocal. I said no. Now get off my land. Carson's smile faded. You're making a mistake. We're being polite now, but we don't have to be. And I don't have to let you leave, Gideon said quietly, and something in his voice made all three men shift uneasily. You came up here armed, onto my property, threatened my household. Mountain law says I can defend my home by whatever means necessary. You're one man, one of the other men started. And you're three, Gideon interrupted. Which means I can probably only kill two of you before the third gets me. Question is, which two? His eyes moved over them slowly, deliberately. My guess? You, Carson, because you're the leader. And you, he nodded at the man who'd spoken, because you're already reaching for your gun. The man's hand froze halfway to his weapon. But here's what you haven't considered, Gideon continued, his voice dropping to something cold and deadly. The old woman you're so interested in. She's standing at the window right now with my rifle. And she's got it aimed at whichever one of you tries to move first. She might be old, but she's not stupid. And at this range, even a shaky shot will take off someone's head. Lin Mei made herself visible in the window, the rifle clearly pointed at the men. Carson's expression shifted from confident to calculating. He was reassessing, trying to determine if Gideon was bluffing. This doesn't have to end badly, Gideon said. You can mount your horses and ride out. Tell whoever sent you that Gideon Rourke isn't interested in business partnerships. And if anyone else comes up here with similar offers, they'll get the same answer, permanently. The threat hung in the frozen air. Carson stared at Gideon for a long moment, then at Lin Mei in the window. Whatever he saw convinced him that the risk outweighed the reward. This isn't over, he said, but he was already backing toward his horse. Yeah, it is, Gideon said, because if I see any of you again, I won't bother with warnings. The three men mounted and rode off, their horses churning through the snow. Gideon stood motionless until they disappeared from sight, then remained there for another 10 minutes, watching, making sure they didn't circle back. Only when he was certain they were truly gone did he approach the cabin. Lin Mei opened the door, the rifle still in her hands. Are you all right? He asked. Yes. Are you? He nodded, then looked at her more closely. You would have shot them if they'd tried to force their way in, wouldn't you? Yes, Lin Mei said without hesitation. Something like pride flashed across his face. Good. That's good. He stepped inside, closing and bolting the door behind him. But we need to talk about what just happened. They sat at the table, and Gideon laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Those men work for someone with money and no morals. Mining operations like they mentioned, they go through cooks like water because the conditions are terrible and the pay is worse. They heard about you, probably from someone who talked to Briggs, and decided to make you an offer. By coming here with guns? By coming here to intimidate me into selling your contract, which I don't have, obviously, but they don't know that. Gideon ran a hand through his hair. They'll be back. Maybe not those three, but someone else. Word's out now that there's value here, and that makes us a target. Lin Mei felt cold despite the warmth of the cabin. What do? We prepare, Gideon said grimly, and we make it very clear that coming after us costs more than we're worth. Over the next 3 days, Gideon transformed the cabin into something closer to a fortress. He reinforced the door with iron bars he'd been saving for other projects, built heavy shutters for the windows that could be barred from inside, and set up a series of warning bells on the approaches to the clearing, tripwires that would alert them if anyone came near. Lin Mei watched him work with quiet intensity, understanding that this was how he processed fear, by taking action, by building defenses, by refusing to be caught unprepared again. But on the fourth morning, she found him standing motionless by the window, staring out at the snow-covered mountains with an expression that made her chest tighten. You're thinking about asking me to leave, she said quietly. He didn't turn around. I'm thinking that I brought this danger to you, that you'd be safer anywhere else. That's not your decision to make. Isn't it? He finally looked at her, and the anguish in his eyes was raw. Those men came here because of you. Because of something I allowed. You staying, becoming known. If I'd sent you away at the beginning, then I'd be dead, Lin May interrupted firmly. I was dying when I found this cabin, Gideon. You know that. I had maybe 2 more days in me before the mountain took me. She crossed the room to stand beside him. Whatever danger we face now, it's still better than the certainty of what I was facing then. You don't know what men like Carson are capable of. I know exactly what men like him are capable of, she said, and there was steel in her voice. I survived 30 years running a business in a city that didn't want Chinese people in it. I've been threatened, robbed, had my restaurant vandalized 3 times. I've had men try to force me into contracts that would have made me a slave in everything but name. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not some fragile thing that breaks at the first sign of trouble. I'm a survivor, just like you. Gideon studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, respect, acceptance. You're right, he said finally. I'm sorry. I was treating you like someone who needed protecting instead of someone who can fight her own battles. I do need protecting sometimes, Lin May admitted, just like you do, but we protect each other. That's what makes us stronger than Carson and his men expect. He nodded slowly, then looked back out at the mountains. There's another storm coming, big one by the look of those clouds. When it hits, we'll be completely isolated for at least a week, maybe more. Good, Lin May said. Let it come. Let it bury us so deep that anyone trying to find us thinks twice about the effort. The storm arrived that night with a ferocity that dwarfed everything they'd experienced so far. Wind screamed around the cabin like something alive and furious, driving snow so hard it sounded like sand against the shuttered windows. The temperature dropped until frost formed thick on every surface inside the cabin despite the roaring fire. They huddled close to the stove, wrapped in every blanket and fur they owned, while the world outside tried to tear itself apart. This is what the old-timers meant, Gideon said, his voice barely audible over the wind, when they said it would be the worst winter in 20 years. Lin May was silent, listening to the raw power of the storm. It was terrifying and humbling, a reminder of how small they were, how fragile their shelter, how quickly the mountain could reclaim everything if it chose to. But there was something else too, a strange peace in knowing they were here together, that neither of them had to face this alone. The storm raged for 6 days. On the 3rd day, they heard a crash from the stable, something giving way under the weight of snow and wind. Gideon had to go out, had to check on the horses, but the visibility was 0 and the cold was lethal. Lin May tied the rope around his waist again, securing the other end to the iron stove, creating a lifeline. Then she bundled him in every piece of warm clothing they had until he looked twice his normal size. 30 minutes, she said firmly. If you're not back in 30 minutes, I'm pulling you in whether you're ready or not. Agreed, he said, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. He pushed open the door and disappeared into a wall of white. Lin May stood by the stove, watching the rope play out, counting the seconds. The wind howled. Snow blew in through gaps around the doorframe despite all their preparations. Her hands ached from gripping the rope, ready to pull at the first sign of trouble. 20 minutes passed. Then 25. At 28 minutes, the rope went slack. Lin May's heart stopped. She pulled hard, felt resistance, then nothing. The rope had gone slack again. Either Gideon had untied himself or something had happened to him. She grabbed her coat, preparing to go after him. Then the door burst open and Gideon stumbled through, covered head to toe in snow and ice, leading both horses behind him. The stable's gone, he gasped, his lips blue with cold. Whole north wall collapsed. Had to bring them in or they'd freeze. Together they got the horses settled in the corner of the cabin farthest from the fire. Close enough for warmth, but not so close they'd panic from the heat and flames. The animals stood shivering and wide-eyed, their presence making the small space even more cramped, but they were alive. Lin May stripped the frozen clothing from Gideon, her hands working quickly despite their shaking. His skin was white in patches where frostbite had started to set in. She rubbed his hands and feet vigorously, forcing circulation back, ignoring his groans of pain as feeling returned. Foolish, she muttered, wrapping him in dry blankets. Could have died out there. The horses, he tried to explain through chattering teeth. I know, she interrupted. I know why you did it, but you're no good to them or to me if you're dead. She made him drink hot broth, forced warmth back into his body with methodical determination. By the time his shivering finally stopped, hours had passed and full dark had fallen. Thank you, Gideon said quietly, his voice hoarse from the cold, for not letting me turn into a frozen monument to stubbornness. Someone has to keep you alive, Lin Mei said, but her tone was gentle. You're the only person I've got. That night they slept sitting up near the fire, the horses shifting and snorting in the darkness, the storm continuing its assault on the walls. It was the most uncomfortable night either of them had spent in months, but there was something profound about it too. All four of them, human and animal, surviving together in their small circle of warmth against the brutal indifference of winter. When the storm finally broke on the sixth day, they emerged to a landscape that had been completely transformed. Snow lay 8 feet deep in places, sculpted into massive drifts that buried the collapsed stable entirely and came halfway up the cabin walls. The world was silent and white and utterly still. We'll have to rebuild the stable, Gideon said, surveying the damage. But not until spring. The horses will have to stay in the cabin until then. It's crowded, Lin Mei observed. It's survival, he corrected. We make do with what we have. They spent the next week digging out, creating paths through the snow, salvaging what they could from the buried stable. The work was exhausting, but it felt good to move after days of forced inactivity, to use their muscles and see progress. Lin Mei discovered she'd grown stronger over the months on the mountain. Tasks that would have defeated her in San Francisco, hauling heavy loads, working for hours in brutal cold, had become simply part of her daily routine. You've changed, Gideon observed one afternoon, watching her efficiently split kindling. Not just stronger, different. How so? More sure of yourself, like you know exactly where you belong and don't need anyone else to confirm it. Lin Mei paused, considering his words. Maybe the mountain does that, strips away the parts of you that were only there because other people expected them. And what's left? Gideon asked. She looked at him directly. What's real? What matters? What you'd die to protect? That evening, as they sat by the fire with the horses drowsing in the corner, Gideon pulled out a piece of paper he'd been working on, a rough sketch of a new stable design. When spring comes, he said, we'll build this. Bigger than before, stronger. Stone foundation, reinforced roof. We won't be caught unprepared again. Lin Mei noticed the change in his language. Not, I'll build, but we'll build. They'd become a true partnership now. Not just two people sharing space, but something deeper and more permanent. And here, Gideon pointed to another section of the sketch. This will be the garden you wanted, protected from the wind by the stable on one side and the cabin on the other. Good soil there, gets afternoon sun. We'll put in the herbs and spices, maybe some vegetables that can handle the altitude. You've been thinking about this, Lin Mei said softly. All winter, he admitted. Planning what we'll do when the snow melts, how we'll make this place not just survivable, but good, worth staying for. The vulnerability in his words made her throat tight. It's already worth staying for. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen before. Open, hopeful, almost tender. Lin Mei, he started, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that didn't come easily. I need you to know that what we have here, it's not just convenience for me. It's not just about the cooking or the work. You've become, he struggled, then tried again. You've become important, essential. And if something happened to you, if those men came back and nothing's going to happen to me, she interrupted gently. We're going to survive this winter, rebuild in spring, and plant that garden together. Together, he repeated, and the words seemed to settle something in him. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the fire crack and the horses breathe, and in that moment the cabin felt less like a shelter against the wilderness and more like a home they'd built together from nothing but determination and trust. March arrived with a subtle shift in the light. The days grew noticeably longer, and though the cold remained fierce, there was a different quality to it, less relentless, less permanent. The mountain was beginning to loosen winter's grip. One morning, Lin Mei woke to a sound she hadn't heard in months, water dripping from the eaves. The first real thaw, still tentative but unmistakable. "It's starting," Gideon said when she emerged from her room. He was already dressed, eager energy in his movements. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks, and the pass will be clear enough for Briggs to make it through." "Should we be worried?" Lin May asked, thinking of Carson and his implied threats. "Maybe," Gideon admitted, "but Briggs will have news. He'll know if Carson's been talking, if there's real trouble brewing, or if it was just intimidation that didn't amount to anything." 2 weeks later, they heard the warning bells jingle, someone approaching the cabin. Both of them tensed immediately, Gideon reaching for his rifle while Lin May positioned herself by the window. But the figure that emerged from the tree line was alone and familiar, Briggs Talon on his stocky horse, looking thinner than when they'd last seen him, but very much alive. Gideon stepped out onto the porch, rifle lowered but still held ready. "Briggs, wasn't expecting you for another few weeks." "Found an early break in the weather and decided to risk it," Briggs called back. "Got news you need to hear." They brought him inside, and Lin May immediately started preparing food while Briggs warmed himself by the fire. The trader looked exhausted, his face windburned and his clothes showing signs of hard travel. "Carson came looking for you," Briggs said without preamble. "Week after you sent him packing. Wanted to know about your setup here, your defenses, how well armed you were." "What did you tell him?" Gideon asked. "Told him to go to hell," Briggs said flatly. "Then told him that anyone who messed with Gideon Rourke would have to answer to every trader in the territory, because you're one of the few trappers who deals honest and doesn't try to cheat on pelts." He accepted the coffee Lin May offered with a grateful nod. He didn't like it, but he backed off. For now. "For now," Gideon repeated grimly. "There's more," Briggs continued. "The mining operation Carson works for, it's in trouble. They've been cutting corners on safety, treating workers like disposable goods. There was a collapse 2 weeks ago, killed 7 men. The territorial marshal is sniffing around now, asking questions." "So Carson's bosses are desperate," Lin May said, understanding immediately. "They need something to distract from their failures and legal troubles. And a legendary cook who can make miracles with simple ingredients would be quite the distraction," Briggs agreed. "Give the workers something to talk about besides dead colleagues and dangerous conditions." "They're still coming then," Gideon said. "Maybe. Maybe not. Depends on whether the marshal shuts them down first." Briggs set down his coffee. "But here's the thing. Word spread further than just Carson's operation. People are talking about the cook in the mountains who can make bear meat taste like heaven. You've got trappers and miners asking me if the stories are true, if there's really an old Chinese woman up here working magic with a stove." Lin May felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was exactly what she'd feared, becoming a legend, a story, something people would seek out whether she wanted them to or not. "What did you tell them?" she asked quietly. "Told them it's all exaggeration," Briggs said. "Tall tales that grow in the telling. Said you're just a decent cook who makes basic food for a mountain trapper. Nothing special." He met her eyes. "But I don't know how much longer I can keep that story alive, especially after I tasted that bear meat myself." "We appreciate you trying," Gideon said. "Yeah, well," Briggs shifted uncomfortably. "I also came to warn you about something else. There's been talk of the territorial government offering land grants to encourage settlement up here. Prime trapping territory would be affected. They might try to push you off this claim, say it needs to be surveyed and registered properly." Gideon's expression hardened. "This is my land. Been here 14 years, built everything with my own hands. That counts for something." "In theory, yes. In practice?" Briggs shrugged. "Government does what it wants. And if someone with money and influence wants your land, they'll find a legal way to take it." The implications hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just about Lin May anymore. Now their entire home was potentially at risk. After Briggs left the next morning, loaded with pelts and promising to return in 2 weeks with more supplies and news, Gideon and Lin May sat at the table in silence. "We could run," Gideon said finally. "Pack up, move deeper into the mountains where they'd never find us." "And leave everything you've built?" Lin May shook her head. "No, this is your home. Our home. We don't run." "Then what do we do?" Lin May was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then she said, "We make ourselves too valuable to threaten, too essential to remove." "How?" Briggs said people are talking, asking questions. What if we controlled that narrative? What if instead of hiding, We selectively shared. Gideon frowned. I don't follow. The trappers and miners, they're not the enemy. Carson's bosses are. The government bureaucrats are. But the working men? Lin Mei leaned forward. They're just trying to survive, like us. What if we found a way to help them that also protected us? You want to cook for them, Gideon said slowly, understanding dawning. Not for everyone, not all the time, but maybe… She thought it through as she spoke. Maybe once a month, Briggs brings a few people here, trappers who deal fair, miners who aren't part of Carson's operation. We feed them. They tell honest stories about what they find, not legends or exaggerations, just the truth. That we're good people living quiet lives who deserve to be left alone. You're talking about building alliances, Gideon said. I'm talking about building community, the kind that protects its own when threats come calling. Lin Mei met his eyes. The mountain taught me I'm stronger than I knew, but it also taught me that even the strongest people need others sometimes. We can't fight the whole territory alone. But if we have friends, real friends who understand what we're about, that changes everything. Gideon sat back considering. It went against every instinct he'd developed over 14 years of isolation, every defense mechanism he'd built to protect himself from loss and pain. But he also couldn't deny the logic. And more than that, he couldn't deny that the months with Lin Mei had shown him something he'd forgotten. That connection, real connection with another person, made life not just bearable, but rich. We'd have to be careful, he said. Choose carefully who we trust. Always, Lin Mei agreed, but we choose together, and we protect what we've built together. He reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that still felt new and slightly awkward for both of them, but genuine. Together, he said. The next week brought the kind of weather that made them both believe spring might actually arrive. The snow began to recede in earnest, revealing patches of brown earth and the first brave shoots of new growth. The creek, frozen solid for months, began to run again, filling the air with the sound of moving water. Gideon started work on the new stable design, hauling stones from the creek bed for the foundation. Lin Mei helped when she could, but she also began planning the garden in earnest, sketching out beds and plotting what would go where. One afternoon, while Gideon was working on the stable foundation, Lin Mei heard the warning bells again. She grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, but relaxed slightly when she saw it was just one rider, and not one of Carson's men. The stranger was young, maybe 20, dressed in simple work clothes and riding a tired-looking mule. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, clearly uncertain. "Hello, the cabin," he called out. "I'm looking for Gideon Rourke." Gideon appeared from behind the stable site, wiping his hands on his pants. "I'm Rourke. State your business." The young man dismounted, moving carefully, showing he wasn't armed. "Name's Peter Chen. I worked at the Morrison mine, the one that had the collapse." Lin Mei's attention sharpened. Morrison mine was where Carson worked. "What do you want?" Gideon asked, his tone neutral, but wary. "I heard there was a Chinese woman here," Peter said, and his eyes found Lin Mei in the window. "Someone who knows real cooking, who understands the old ways." His voice cracked slightly. "My mother died last month. Before she went, she kept asking for her mother's soup, the one with ginger and green onion that she made when we were sick as kids. I tried to make it, but couldn't get it right, and she died without—" He stopped, composing himself. "I just wanted to learn how to make it properly, so I could remember her right, so I could make it for my own family someday." Lin Mei felt her chest tighten. She set down the rifle and opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. "What was your mother's name?" she asked in Cantonese. Peter's face transformed with relief at hearing his own language. "Chen Mei Ling," he answered in the same tongue. "From Guangdong province originally." "And the soup she wanted? Describe it to me." "Clear broth with shredded chicken, ginger slices, green onion, maybe some mushrooms. She said her mother made it whenever anyone in the family was sick or sad, that it could cure anything except death itself." Lin Mei nodded slowly. "I know this soup. My own mother made it. Her mother taught her." She switched back to English, aware of Gideon listening. "You can come in. I'll teach you." Gideon shot her a questioning look, and she met his eyes with steady certainty. This was the right thing to do. This was how they built the protection they needed, not through force, but through human connection. Peter Chen spent 3 hours in their cabin that afternoon, watching with intense concentration as Lin Mei showed him how to make his mother's soup. Not just the mechanics of it, but the care that went into each step. The way you sliced the ginger to release the right amount of heat, the precise moment to add the green onion so it wilted but didn't lose its bright color. The importance of starting with good bone broth that carried warmth all the way through. When it was done and Peter tasted it, tears ran down his face. "That's it," he whispered. "That's exactly it. Thank you." He tried to pay them, but Lin Mei refused. "Knowledge like this shouldn't be bought. It should be shared. Just promise me something." "Anything," Peter said. "Tell people the truth about what you found here. Not legends, not exaggerations, just that there's an old woman and a quiet man living in the mountains, trying to make a good life, who helped you when you needed it." "I promise," Peter said solemnly. After he left, Gideon stood beside Lin Mei on the porch, watching the young man ride away. "That was a risk," he said. "It was necessary," she countered. "He'll tell his story. Others will hear it. And when Carson or the government comes looking for trouble, they'll find people who know we're not threats. We're just human beings who deserve to be left in peace." Gideon considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're building something here, not just alliances. A reputation for kindness. Is that so different from the reputation you've built?" Lin Mei asked. "For fair dealing? For honesty? For being someone people can trust?" "I suppose not," he admitted. They stood together in the fading light, watching the mountains emerge from winter's grip, and both of them felt the same thing, that they were building something worth defending, something that combined their strengths and their histories into a future neither had imagined possible. The last snows of winter melted away, and with them, the last of their isolation. But they didn't face what came next alone. They faced it together, ready to protect what they'd created and become. Peter Chen's visit changed something fundamental in how they thought about their place on the mountain. Word spread quietly through the network of trappers and miners, not the sensational stories Carson had tried to use against them, but simpler, truer accounts. An old woman who understood grief and loss, a mountain man who valued honesty over profit, a cabin where kindness still existed in a hard world. Over the next month, 3 more people made the journey up the mountain. Each time, Gideon watched carefully from a distance while Lin Mei evaluated their intentions. A trapper's wife who wanted to learn how to preserve meat properly for her growing family. An old miner who'd worked alongside Chinese laborers for 20 years and just wanted to taste food that reminded him of friends long gone. A young couple starting their own homestead who needed advice on what crops could survive at high altitude. Lin Mei helped each of them, never asking for payment, but accepting what they offered. Knowledge traded for knowledge, skills for skills, stories for stories. One man brought seeds for Chinese vegetables his grandfather had carried from Canton. The trapper's wife taught Lin Mei a method for tanning hides that used less salt. The young couple shared news from the territorial capital about new settlement laws. Slowly, carefully, they were weaving themselves into the fabric of the mountain community, not as legends or threats, but as people worth knowing and protecting. But Carson hadn't forgotten them. The confrontation came on a bright April morning when the aspens were just beginning to bud, and the garden plot Gideon had prepared was finally dry enough to plant. Lin Mei was in the yard, carefully marking out rows for her herbs, when she heard horses approaching. Not 1 or 2, but many. At least 6, maybe more. She straightened slowly, her hand moving to the knife she now kept at her belt. Gideon was at the creek, hauling stones for the stable foundation. Too far to reach her quickly if things went wrong. Carson rode into the clearing at the head of a group of 7 men, all armed, all looking like they meant business. But this time he wasn't alone in leadership. Beside him rode a well-dressed man in an expensive coat, completely out of place in the wilderness. "Mrs. Lin Mei," Carson called out, his voice carrying false politeness. "We've come to make you a proper offer. This is Mr. Edmund Halford, owner of the Morrison Mining Company. He'd like to speak with you about employment opportunities." The well-dressed man dismounted with the careful movements of someone unused to riding. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and eyes that assessed everything in terms of value and profit. "Ma'am," Halford said, removing his hat, "I apologize for the dramatic arrival, but Mr. Carson assures me you've been resistant to previous offers. I thought a personal visit might clarify matters." There's nothing to clarify, Lin Mei said calmly, though her heart was pounding. I'm not interested in working for your company. You haven't heard the offer yet, Halford said smoothly. I'm prepared to pay you $300 a month, more than most men make in a year, to oversee food preparation for my workers. You'd have a proper kitchen, assistants, whatever supplies you need, and, of course, we'd provide comfortable housing. No, Lin Mei said. You're refusing without even considering to... I don't need to consider it. My answer is no. Halford's expression hardened. Mrs. Lin Mei, I don't think you understand the situation. The Morrison Mining Company has significant influence in the territorial government. We've been reviewing land claims in this area, and it seems Mr. Rourke's claim was never properly registered. That makes this disputed territory, which means you're threatening to steal land that doesn't belong to you. Gideon's voice cut across the clearing. He'd returned from the creek and now stood with his rifle held casually but unmistakably ready. To dress it up however you want, Halford, but that's what you're doing. Mr. Rourke, Halford turned to face him, be reasonable. You're one man with a questionable claim to this land. I represent a company with resources and legal authority. If you cooperate, I'm prepared to offer you fair compensation for relocating. Get off my land, Gideon said quietly. I'm afraid it's not that simple anymore, Halford replied. You see, I've already filed the paperwork with the territorial office. This land is now under review for mineral rights and potential development. You have 30 days to vacate, or the territorial marshal will remove you by force. Lin Mei felt ice flood through her veins. They'd prepared for threats, for intimidation, even for violence, but not for this. The cold machinery of law being used to destroy them. That's illegal, Gideon said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. You can't just claim occupied land. I can if it was never properly filed, Halford interrupted. And according to territorial records, it wasn't. Your claim doesn't exist legally, which means this land is open for development. He pulled a folded document from his coat and held it up. This is the official notice. You'll find it's all perfectly legal. Carson was grinning now, clearly enjoying watching them realize the trap they were in. But before Gideon could respond, another voice rang out across the clearing. Actually, Mr. Halford, you'll find it's not legal at all. Everyone turned to see Briggs Talon riding into the clearing, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came 5 other riders, trappers and traders Lin Mei recognized from the winter market, men who'd dealt fairly with Gideon for years. And behind them, unexpectedly, came Peter Chen and the young couple Lin Mei had helped, along with a dozen others she didn't recognize but who clearly knew her by reputation. Briggs dismounted, pulling his own set of papers from his saddlebag. Funny thing about land claims, Halford, they don't have to be filed with the territorial office to be valid. They can also be established through witness testimony, proof that the land has been continuously occupied and improved for the required period. He handed the papers to Gideon. I took the liberty of collecting statements from every trapper and trader who's done business with you over the past 14 years. 23 separate testimonies, all notarized, all confirming that you've occupied this land, built structures, and maintained it as your homestead since 1852. Halford's expression shifted from confident to uncertain. Those statements would need to be verified. They already have been, another voice called out. An older man in a marshal's badge rode into the clearing, his face weathered and serious. I'm Marshal Thomas Greer. I've been investigating the Morrison Mining Company's land acquisition practices, and I've found some interesting irregularities. He looked directly at Halford, including 3 other claims you've tried to invalidate through false documentation. The territorial governor is not pleased, Mr. Halford. In fact, he's authorized me to inform you that all your pending land claims are suspended pending a full investigation into fraud. The color drained from Halford's face. This is outrageous. What's outrageous is trying to steal a man's home through legal manipulation, the marshal said coldly. Mr. Rourke's claim is valid and will be formally registered as of today. You and your men need to leave this property immediately, or I'll arrest you for trespassing and attempted claim jumping. Carson's hand moved toward his gun, but he froze when he realized that every man who'd come with Briggs had their weapons ready. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Halford looked around, seeing his power crumbling, then turned back to Lin Mei with one last attempt. Mrs. Lin Mei, surely you can see that working for me would be... I see a man who tried to use law as a weapon to destroy good people, Lin Mei said, her voice cutting like a blade. I see someone who values profit over human dignity, and I see someone I would never, under any circumstances, work for. Halford's face flushed with rage and humiliation. You're making a mistake, both of you. This territory is changing, and people like you, people who refuse to adapt, you'll be left behind. Maybe, Gideon said, but we'll be left behind on our own land, living our own lives, answering to nobody but ourselves. That's more than you can say. The marshal gestured toward the trail. Time to go, gentlemen. Halford remounted stiffly, his dignity in tatters. Carson followed, but not before shooting Gideon a look of pure hatred. This isn't over, he said quietly. Yeah, it is, Briggs called out cheerfully. Word is the Morrison mine is shutting down. Safety violations, unpaid wages, and now fraud charges. You'll be lucky if you're not in prison this time next year, Carson. The group rode out, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Then slowly, people began to speak, offering congratulations, sharing their relief, explaining how they'd learned of the threat, and decided to come. Peter Chen got word to me about Halford's plans, Briggs explained to Gideon and Lin Mei. He'd been working at the mine, heard them talking about how they were going to force you out. He rode to the trading post and spread the word, and folks just started showing up, wanting to help. Peter stepped forward, looking almost shy. You helped me when I needed it. Seemed only right to return the favor. The young couple nodded. You gave us advice that probably saved our first crop. We wouldn't have made it through spring planting without what you taught us. One by one, people shared their reasons for coming. Small kindnesses Lin Mei had forgotten, fair deals Gideon had honored over the years. The simple fact that they represented something decent in a hard world, and that was worth protecting. Lin Mei felt tears prickling her eyes. She'd spent so long believing she was alone that the world had turned its back on her. But here was proof that connection mattered, that the small acts of kindness they'd shown had created bonds stronger than any legal document. Marshal Greer approached Gideon, handing him an official-looking paper. This is your registered claim, properly filed and stamped. It's good in perpetuity, long as you maintain the property. Nobody can challenge it now. Thank you, Marshal, Gideon said, his voice rough with emotion. Thank Briggs and these folks, the Marshal replied. They're the ones who made the case. I just confirmed what was already true, that this is your home and you've earned the right to keep it. The Marshal left, but the others stayed, helping to celebrate the victory and sharing news and stories. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey, another brought dried meat and bread. What had started as a confrontation turned into an impromptu gathering. Lin Mei found herself in the cabin kitchen, preparing food for their unexpected guests with the help of the trapper's wife and two other women who'd come along. It reminded her of the old days in San Francisco, the communal cooking and sharing that had made the restaurant feel like family. You've built something special here, the trapper's wife said, efficiently chopping vegetables. People talk about you and Gideon like you're proof that good things can still happen, even in hard times. We just tried to survive, Lin Mei said. No, the woman corrected gently. You tried to live. There's a difference. And you helped others do the same. As the sun began to set, people started to leave, heading back to their own homes and claims. But they left with promises to return, to help with the stable construction, to share the garden harvest when it came, to remain part of the community they'd helped protect. When the last visitor had gone and only Briggs remained, sitting on the porch with Gideon and Lin Mei, the trader raised his whiskey in a toast. To surviving the worst winter in 20 years, he said, and to building something worth coming back to. They drank, and in the gathering darkness, Lin Mei felt a peace she hadn't known since Wei died. Maybe even before that. This was home. Not because of the building or the land, but because of what she and Gideon had created together and what they'd built with others. I'll be back in 2 weeks, Briggs said, standing to leave. Got a load of lumber you ordered for the stable and some other supplies, including, he added with a grin at Lin Mei, a packet of seeds from a trader who swore they're authentic star fruit from Canton. Thought you might want to try growing them. Star fruit won't survive here, Lin Mei said, but she was smiling. Maybe not, Briggs agreed, but seems like you've made plenty of impossible things work already. After he left, Gideon and Lin Mei remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the mountain, the creek running high with snow melt, an owl calling from the pines, the horses shifting in the stable they'd soon rebuild. "I was thinking," Gideon said slowly, "about the garden, and about what you said once, about how food carries memory and meaning." "Yes?" "There's a spot on the south side of the property where Sarah used to want to plant roses. She never got the chance." He paused. "I was thinking maybe we could put them there now. Not as a memorial exactly, but as a way of, I don't know, honoring the past while building something new." Lin Mei felt her throat tighten with emotion at the trust he was showing, the vulnerability in sharing this piece of his grief. "I think that's beautiful," she said softly. "And I know exactly where we can get rose cuttings. The woman who taught me about hide tanning, she has wild roses on her property." She offered to share. Gideon nodded, seeming relieved. "Good. That's good." He was quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "Lin Mei, I need to say something, and I'm not sure I'll say it right." "Just say it," she encouraged. "When you showed up last fall, half dead and stubborn as a mule, I took you in because it seemed like the practical thing to do. Figured you'd last a week, maybe two, then move on." He turned to look at her directly. "I never expected you to stay. Never expected to want you to stay. And I definitely never expected to realize that somewhere along the way, this stopped being just my cabin and became our home." Lin Mei's heart was beating hard. "Gideon, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm 61 years old. I've got a scarred heart and more bad memories than good ones. I'm not offering you romance or grand gestures, but I am offering you partnership. Real partnership, the kind that's about building a life together, protecting each other, being family to each other in all the ways that matter." He pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden box he'd carved himself, simple but carefully made. Inside was a ring, hand-formed from silver, the metal worked into a pattern that suggested mountains and sky. "I made this from coins I've been saving," he said, melted them down and shaped it myself. "It's not fancy, but it's honest, and it's meant to represent a promise. That I'll stand by you, work beside you, and defend what we've built together for as long as I draw breath." Lin Mei took the box with shaking hands. The ring caught the lamplight, gleaming softly. "In my culture," she said quietly, "we would call this a marriage proposal." "Is that what you're asking?" "If you'll have me," Gideon said. "I know I'm not much of a catch." "Stop," Lin Mei interrupted, and there was fierceness in her voice. "You're a man who saved my life, who gave me shelter when I had nothing, who treated me as an equal when the world wanted to make me less, who built a home with me through the worst winter imaginable and came out the other side stronger." She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Yes, Gideon Rourke, I'll marry you. I'll be your partner, your family, and whatever else we decide to become to each other." He let out a breath he'd clearly been holding, and something like wonder crossed his face. "Really?" "Really," she confirmed, and then she was in his arms, both of them holding each other with the desperation of people who'd learned how precious connection was and how easily it could be lost. They stood there on the porch under the stars, two people who'd survived tremendous loss and found their way to something new. Not a replacement for what they'd had before, but something equally valuable and entirely their own. "We should probably have someone official perform a ceremony," Gideon said eventually, still holding her close. "Marshal Greer mentioned he's authorized to perform marriages," Lin Mei said. "We could ask him next time he passes through. Or we could ask Briggs to bring a preacher on his next trip," Gideon suggested. "Or," Lin Mei said thoughtfully, "we could simply consider ourselves married by mountain law. We've built a life together, made promises to each other in front of witnesses. What more official ceremony do we need?" Gideon smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and lighter than she'd ever seen. "Mountain law it is, then. Simple and honest, like everything else up here." The next morning, they began work on the garden in earnest. The ground was finally soft enough to work, and together they prepared the beds Lin Mei had planned all winter. Gideon built raised boxes from wood he'd saved, filling them with rich soil mixed with compost they'd been building since fall. Lin Mei planted her precious seeds, the herbs and spices that would connect her to her past while grounding her in this new future. Ginger root that might not survive, but deserved the chance. Garlic and green onions that would thrive. The mysterious star fruit seeds Briggs had promised, planted more in hope than expectation. And on the south side of the property, in the spot Gideon had mentioned, they prepared ground for roses, a living bridge between the woman he'd lost and the woman who'd found him. As they worked, they talked about practical things. How to expand the stable to accommodate more animals, whether to add a second room to the cabin or build a separate structure, what crops would be most valuable for trade versus what they needed for themselves. But underneath the practical conversation was something deeper, the steady building of a shared vision for their future, the comfortable synchronicity of two people learning to think as one unit while remaining fully themselves. 3 weeks later, Briggs returned with the lumber and supplies, along with news that made them both smile. The Morrison Mining Company had been shut down permanently. Halford was facing fraud charges, and Carson had fled the territory ahead of an arrest warrant. The workers had been paid what they were owed from seized company assets, and most had found employment elsewhere. "You're free and clear," Briggs reported. "No more threats from that direction." He also brought something unexpected, a letter from Peter Chen, written in careful English. "Dear Mr. Rourke and Mrs. Lin May," it read, "I wanted to thank you again for your kindness and let you know that I've found work at a new mining operation with fair wages and safe conditions. I've also met a young woman from Sacramento whose family is from Guangdong, like my mother. We're planning to marry in the fall. I've taught her how to make my mother's soup, and she cried when she tasted it, saying it reminded her of home. I tell her about you both often, how you proved that kindness and honor still exist in this world. If you ever need anything, you have only to ask. Your grateful friend, Peter Chen." Lin May folded the letter carefully, storing it in her tin box alongside her spices. It represented something precious, proof that the life she and Gideon were building extended beyond just themselves, creating ripples of goodness that touched others in ways they might never fully know. Summer arrived with a glory of wildflowers and long golden days. The garden flourished beyond their best expectations. The herbs grew lush and fragrant, the vegetables produced abundantly, and against all probability, the starfruit seeds sprouted, tiny green shoots that Lin May tended with the care of a mother with a newborn. The new stable was completed in July, a testament to both Gideon's craftsmanship and the help of the community that had come together to defend them. It was larger and stronger than the old one, with proper stone foundations and a roof that could withstand anything winter might throw at it. And on the south side of the property, the rose cuttings took root and began to climb, their first blooms arriving in late August, delicate pink flowers that filled the air with sweetness. Gideon stood before them one evening, Lin May at his side, and said quietly, "Sarah would have liked this, would have liked you." "I would have liked her too," Lin May replied. "Any woman who taught you to value strength and partnership, she must have been remarkable." "She was," Gideon agreed, "but so are you. Different, but equally remarkable." They developed a ritual of sitting on the porch each evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. It was during one of these quiet moments that Lin May spoke of something she'd been thinking about for weeks. "I want to write down my recipes," she said. "The ones I learned from my mother and grandmother, the ones I developed in San Francisco, and the new ones I've created here. Not just the instructions, but the stories behind them. Why certain spices matter, what memories they carry, how food connects us to the people and places we've lost." "That's a good idea," Gideon said. "Knowledge like that should be preserved." "I was thinking we could give it to Peter when he visits," Lin May continued, "for his future children, and maybe make copies for others who might value it. A legacy of sorts." "A cookbook," Gideon said thoughtfully. "But more than that. A record of survival, of adaptation, of making beauty from hardship." "Yes," Lin May agreed. "Exactly that." She began the work that autumn, carefully writing out recipes in both English and Chinese, annotating them with stories and memories. Gideon helped, his surprisingly elegant handwriting filling page after page with her dictated instructions. It became their winter project. While snow fell outside and the fire crackled, they worked together to preserve something precious, creating a bridge between past and future. Winter came again, but this time they faced it with confidence born of experience. Their stores were abundant, their shelter was secure, and most importantly, they had each other. The long dark months were no longer something to endure, but time to rest, to plan, to dream about what spring would bring. They played chess and told stories. Lin Mei taught Gideon some basic Cantonese phrases, and he taught her the names of constellations as they appeared in the mountain sky. They cooked elaborate meals just for the pleasure of it, experimenting with new combinations of flavors and techniques. And on the coldest nights, they would sit close to the fire and talk about the future, about expanding the garden, about possibly taking in an apprentice to learn Lin Mei's cooking, about building a real smokehouse for preserving meat, about all the possibilities that stretched before them like an unmarked trail waiting to be explored. Spring returned with its usual dramatic transformation. The snow melted, the creek roared with runoff, and the world exploded into green life. Marshal Greer stopped by in early May, bringing final confirmation that all charges against the Morrison Mining Company had resulted in convictions, and that the territorial government had implemented new protections for homesteaders to prevent similar fraud in the future. "Your case made a difference," he told them. "Changed how we handle land claims throughout the territory. So thank you for standing your ground." He also brought an unexpected question. "I'm wondering if you two might be willing to serve as occasional resources for other homesteaders in the area. Nothing formal, just advice when folks need it. How to handle mountain winters, what crops work at altitude, that sort of thing. You've proven you know how to not just survive, but thrive up here." Gideon and Lin Mei exchanged glances, that wordless communication they'd developed over the months. "We can do that," Gideon said. "Long as people understand we're not running a charity operation or trying to become some kind of settlement center." "Just occasional guidance from neighbors who've learned hard lessons," the marshal confirmed. "That's all anyone's asking." True to the marshal's word, over the following months a few homesteaders made the journey up the mountain seeking advice. Gideon showed them his water management system and taught them about reading weather patterns. Lin Mei shared her preservation techniques and gave them starter plants from her flourishing garden. Each visitor left with something valuable, and in return they brought news and occasionally supplies, a fair exchange that benefited everyone. The star fruit plants, against all logic and expectation, survived their first winter and actually produced fruit in their second summer, small, tart, and wonderfully exotic. Lin Mei wept the first time she tasted them, transported back to childhood memories of her grandmother's garden in Canton. "Impossible things happen here," Gideon observed, watching her carefully preserve seeds from the precious fruit. "You brought magic to this mountain." "Not magic," Lin Mei corrected gently. "Just stubbornness, patience, and refusal to accept that things can't change." On their second anniversary of meeting, though neither had marked the exact date, they chose the day the first snow had fallen when they'd committed to facing winter together. Gideon presented Lin Mei with a gift. It was a wooden sign he'd carved and painted with careful detail. It read simply, "Mei's Garden" in English, with the Chinese characters for home beneath it. "For the garden gate," he explained. "So everyone knows who built this, whose skill and knowledge made all this possible." Lin Mei ran her fingers over the smooth wood, the precise lettering. "Gideon, it's beautiful." "So are you," he said simply. "And I wanted something permanent that acknowledged that, something that would last beyond us, that would tell future people that Lin Mei lived here, built here, created beauty here." They mounted the sign together, and it became a landmark for visitors, a welcome point that announced they were entering a place where care and dedication had transformed wilderness into sanctuary. Years passed in the rhythm of mountain life. Seasons cycled through their changes, bringing challenges and blessings in equal measure. Their garden expanded until it was famous throughout the territory, producing vegetables and herbs that shouldn't have been possible at that altitude but thrived anyway under Lin Mei's patient care. The cookbook she'd written was copied and shared, becoming a treasured resource for families trying to make good food from limited supplies. She added to it each year, documenting new discoveries and techniques, creating a living record of culinary wisdom. Gideon's hair turned fully gray, then white, but his strength remained. He was known throughout the mountains as a man of his word, fair in all dealings, always willing to help a neighbor in genuine need but unforgiving of those who tried to cheat or exploit. Lin Mei's hands developed the permanent stains and calluses of a life spent working with earth and fire and food, but she wore them proudly. They were proof of purpose, of contribution, of a life well lived. Peter Chen visited occasionally, bringing his wife and eventually his children, 3 daughters who called Lin Mei grandmother and begged for stories about the old country and lessons in traditional cooking. Lin Mei taught them everything she knew, delighting in passing knowledge to a new generation. Briggs Talon remained a loyal friend, his trading routes now specifically designed to check on them several times each season. He was getting older too, talking about retiring, but he always made time for the cabin on the mountain where two stubborn survivors had built something remarkable. One autumn evening, when they were both well into their 70s and the mountains were painted in gold and crimson, Gideon and Lin May sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had hundreds of times before. "I was thinking," Gideon said, his voice carrying the roughness of age but also deep contentment, "about that first day you showed up here, how close I came to sending you away." "Would have been the practical thing to do," Lin May said with dry humor. "I was more burden than asset at first." "Would have been the stupidest thing I ever did," Gideon corrected. "You changed everything, turned survival into living, made a house into a home, gave me reasons to care about tomorrow instead of just enduring today." Lin May took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "You gave me a reason to keep going when I'd lost everything. You showed me that starting over wasn't just possible, but worthwhile. That there's value in building something new, even after you thought your building days were done." "Think we did all right?" Gideon asked. Lin May looked out at the garden, lush even in autumn, at the sturdy stable and well-maintained cabin, at the roses blooming one last time before frost. She thought about the community they'd helped foster, the lives they'd touched, the legacy they'd created. "We did better than all right," she said firmly. "We built something worth having, something that will outlast us, something that proved kindness and honor and partnership still matter in this world." Gideon squeezed her hand gently. "No regrets then?" "None," Lin May confirmed. "You?" "Not a single one," he said. "Best decision I ever made was telling that stubborn old woman she could stay if she hauled some firewood." Lin May laughed, the sound carrying across the clearing. "Best decision I ever made was proving to that grumpy mountain man that I was tougher than he thought." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged. Two people who'd found each other at the edge of everything and built a life that honored both their pasts and their futures. The cabin behind them glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming. The garden rested, preparing for winter, already carrying seeds of next year's growth. And the mountains stood eternal around them, bearing witness to what determination and partnership could create. Somewhere in the valley below, lights began to appear as other homesteaders settled in for the night. People who'd been helped by the couple on the mountain, who told stories about them to their children, who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in gold or land, but in the strength of the life you built and the goodness you put into the world. The wind carried the scent of pine and earth and the last roses of autumn. Inside the cabin, the stove radiated steady warmth. In the stable, the horses, descendants of smoke and birch, rested peacefully. Everything was exactly as it should be. And as Lin May and Gideon sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, they both felt the same profound gratitude, not for what they'd escaped or survived, but for what they'd found and built together. A home, a partnership, a life worth living. And that, in the end, was more than either of them had dared to hope for when their paths first crossed on that dusty mountain slope so many years ago.